Okay, very own Wayne Memphis Mojo from the Comet section brought in this Super Reverb reissue, 6560 Super Reverb reissue, to have some longevity and reliability tweaks. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is going to remove the bias pot, which will allow me then to remove this board. So it's just a nut on the other side. Let's get that started. You pull the bias pot out of this, and it'll give us the clearance to pull this board. Now I've got to remove all the knobs so I can pull this board out. And again, I've got this container here which has the output tubes and rectifier tube. It has, I already put the filter caps that are going in here, and all the knobs will go in here as well. So I have a small bowl for small parts, this box for larger bits, and it's labeled Super Reverb Reissue Wayne, SRRI Wayne. So just removing knobs. All right, once they're all loosened, just pull them all off. Now I'm going to go through here and pull these multi-pin connectors, these little ribbon cables. And now it's time to remove the screws that hold the little switches in place, and the nuts on the pots, and the nuts on the input jacks. That one was already loose from the factory. So was that. That one was not tight. All right, now that's out. We're going to put it just to the side. Just going to take a dry paper towel, no pressure, just wipe the layer of dust off the front face. It's not anything that'll be abrasive, but it'll get that dust off. All right, now I'm going to disconnect a few wires from the board. Black and green. The reverb stuff can usually stay connected. All right, that should be enough slack for me to be able to pull this board and lift it up and do work on the underneath side. When the time comes, our main focus is going to be getting the components that get hot off this board. So screen, grid resistors, and such. We're going to move those to output tube sockets. Heater balance resistors the same way. Make this thing less likely to have any heat issues that affect the board, especially the heater wires going to these quick connects here. That's just too much current for that quick connect to handle, so that'll go straight to an octal socket. We will get there. You've seen it in other amps in the past. Before I do anything else in here, though, I just wanted to do all this stuff top side. I'm going to flip this over. We're going to take a look at the filter caps. No surprise there, standard IC caps. These aren't leaking yet, but they will. And we're just not going to wait around for that to happen. So these are going away. My better pliers for this purpose bit the dust. I need to get some new sturdier ones, but these needle nose will do it. In a little while we'll get all the silicone off. Right now I'm just getting these big gobs. First thing I want to do is see if there are bends or kinks on the other side. If not, I can just pull these straight out. If there are, then I've got to straighten these and push through. And there aren't really any, so I can just heat these up with some fresh solder and pull them on out from the front. Sometimes they have a little hook, and they should have a little hook on the back, which means you can't just pull them out, you tear up the pads. It's weird, this is supposed to be silicone, but it feels more like an old eraser, the crumbly, yucky erasers that no one liked in school. So let's see, I should have I've got my iron at 750 Fahrenheit for working on this lead-free stuff. Just kind of add a little bit fresh to each one. Boy, that's hot. Okay, now that the leads are out, I'm going to take a razor and get all the old silicone off, or crappy second grade eraser, whatever this is. Seriously, what was the point of those erasers? You try to use them to, erase something, and you just have little bits of brownish, crumbly stuff all over your paper. But the pencil marks would still be there, defiant till the end. Of course, I haven't used an eraser in years. I found it just better not to make mistakes much faster. All right, so before I get the old solder off the other side and prep these for new caps, I want to make sure that these resistors all measure in spec. I've not had too many problems with the reissue fenders. Sometimes the 10Ks and the deluxe reverbs aren't too happy. 4.65. So all that's good. Time to remove the old solder, get these cleaned up and ready for some fresh stuff. All right, all the solder is off. Now it's time to remove that old nasty flux. All right, I'm gonna let that isopropyl dry, and then we'll put new caps in place. I'll do the hundreds first because if I do silicone on all of them at once, I know myself, and I know that I very shortly will have silicone all over my fingers. So only a small amount. You can also apply it to the bottom of the cap. Doesn't really matter as long as you're consistent and to try to take care. I've got the caps pre-bent. Should line up pretty well. They kind of self-sizing if you do it just so. All right, now I don't want the silicone to be the only thing holding them in place. So I'm gonna take my pliers. I'm gonna give them each a right angle bend and then a kink. I'm gonna snip off the excess. Both because this way I'm heating up less metal. And because when I have soldered this, I don't want to apply any shocks from cutting the lead after it's soldered. So right now, this would actually conduct and work just from being held in place with the silicone and those crimps, but I'm not going to rely on that. I'm going to give it some solder at this point. Solder is not being used as glue. Solder is really being used to keep air out of that contact point between the trace, the pad, and the lead of the capacitor, so that none of the metals tarnish with exposure to air. The actual point of connection between the two metals is now sealed off from everything else, and solder itself is nicely conductive. So that's good. So that's the 200 microfarad, 350 volts. I'll do the 322s, and then we'll go from there. I guess it would be good for me to point out that the silicone I'm using is RTV non-reactive. This is by Permatex. You can get this at most auto shops, like AutoZone, etc. About $9. Good stuff. Make sure you put that cap back on or it'll all seal up on you. Okay, all the caps are in place, and you can see the values. Later I'll get my Sharpie and put a little date here saying when these were installed. But they all have nice curved leads. There's no tension on where the lead joins the cap body. All that tension is borne by the leads themselves and by the silicone. I've got a little bit of flux here that I like to clean off before I go forward. So I just give it a little squirt. And I'll get there with the old soft bristle toothbrush. All right, that should be good. And I'll put the lid back on after I've put a date on here, and I'm sure that there's no problem with anything in here. No bad connections on the wires, etc. That's pretty rare, but it's good to undo as little as possible if you need to revisit. All right, now before I remove the hardware holding the board in place, I want to make sure the power transformer hardware is as tight as I can get it. And later I'll make sure that all the output jacks and stuff on the rear panel is tight. First I'm going to remove all these screws that hold the board in place. All right. First thing I want to do is cut the wires going to the heater from the board to the heaters, because I don't need the heater stuff on the board. And like I said, I'll put new heater balances on the octal sockets where they belong. The grid wires, not the grid, but the screen grid wires. You make sure they're the same ones I'm thinking of. It's a little trickier to see on this one. They got the standby, the power switch and the fuse holder so close to this socket here. What the hell, Fender? Every Fender I've ever had, including every reissue, has had the little keyhole on this side, which make this pin 1 and this pin 8. It's reversed here. This is pin 1, this is pin 8, and pin 1 is ground, so these yellow wires are going to ground to these 1 ohms, which is kind of pointless, but whatever. Those 1 watt 470 ohm screen grids are going to go away. So nice 3 watts will go in their place, mount it at the octal socket. Just going to bend these leads up so I can push them through once I heat up the other side. Don't want any kinks in them. Everything else here is looking pretty good. I'm going to change a couple of cathode bypass cap values. That's it. This is not going to be a huge mod as far as changing the sound. It's just going to be a reliability increase. But I'm going to decrease 1 or 2 cathode bypass caps towards the front of the preamp, which will make the entire amp sound sweeter because it's an inexpensive way to get a lot of benefit. And I'll show that later when we get down to that end of the board. And there'll be some other little tweaks as we go. But we're starting off with reliability. So I was just applying some fresh solder on the underside to where those screen grid resistors are. And I'm pushing them out. And they're pretty much just falling out on the other side now. This is kind of exactly the same thing I did on those filter caps that you could see. Get the old solder off from the bottom. And let's see here. All right, they've got the orange screen grid wires all gooped to the board. So I'm not going to bother desoldering them. I'm just going to snip them. Oh, something I meant to do a while back. Let me do it now. This is the safety ground for the amp. Make sure it's tight. Okay, so I've got a new wire soldered here to the screen point. It's a nice quality top coat like I'd use on a Marshall. It's orange for screens. And I'll bring it over here and solder it here, and then get another length to go over here, and we'll do all that later. Not much later, but I mean, not later as far as the video goes. Later as far as my life goes. I'm going to have dinner in a little bit. And then I think I might be ready to screw this board back down, but before I do, I want to go through... Thank you very much, Meter. I appreciate that. I want to go through the schematic and make sure there's not anything weird in the Super Reverb reissue that I've missed. I don't get many of this. The Twin has some idiosyncrasies. The Deluxe has some. I know all the Deluxes and Princeton's reissues very well. I know the Twin pretty well, but I think this is only the 3rd Super Reverb reissue for whatever reason I've had in. Just not as popular a model, but I think it should sound fantastic. The other 2 that I did came out great. So let me just make sure before I button this up that there's nothing in here waiting to cause trouble down the line or anything that I need to upgrade just because.